Story 1. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or anything paranormal. If you'd asked me back then, I would have called myself a realist, probably to a fault. But this one thing, this one night, it stuck with me in a way I can't explain. Even now, I'm not sure what to make of it. A few years ago, one of my closest friends, Jake, was finally turning his life around. Jake had been through hell with addiction, but for the first time in years, he was clean. Not just a week or two, he'd been off heroin for a couple of months. If you've ever known anyone who's been hooked on that stuff, you know how huge that is. He was proud, and honestly, I was proud of him too. One afternoon, we hung out at his place, just kicking back like old times. He had some big news to share. After years of fighting a medical malpractice lawsuit with his mom, they'd finally won. Jake got a payout, somewhere around $15,000. For a guy who'd been scraping by for years, that money was life-changing. He was so pumped, talking about how he was going to buy his mom something nice, maybe pay off her car. He even mentioned using the rest to enroll in college and finally get his life on track. Seeing him like that was, I don't know, it was the happiest I'd seen him in years, maybe ever. I left that night feeling like, for once, things might actually work out for him. 2 nights later, I woke up out of a dead sleep. It was around 1 a.m. I remember looking at the clock. At first, I didn't feel off or groggy, just good. Not just good, though, euphoric. It was like this overwhelming rush of warmth and happiness. You know that feeling when you're lying in the sun on a perfect day, completely content? Multiply that by 1,000. It hit me so fast, and for a moment I thought, wow, this is incredible. But then, just as quickly, it shifted. That euphoria started to feel wrong, like my body knew something was off, even if my brain hadn't caught up yet. My chest tightened and my stomach churned. I started thinking, this isn't right. Something's wrong. Before I could process it, everything went black. When I came to, I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was walking down the creaky wooden stairs to Jake's basement. Now I knew that basement well. We spent years down there playing video games, watching movies, and just being dumb kids. But this time, it felt off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. The fluorescent light in the corner flickered faintly, casting weird shadows across the room. The place was a wreck. Beer bottles and fast food wrappers were scattered everywhere. But what stood out were the needles. Dozens of them, some still half full, glinting under the dim light. Jake was sitting on the old ratty couch we used to crash on. His head was down, hands gripping his knees, his whole body shaking like he was holding back sobs. "Jake," I said, my voice echoing in the silence. I felt like I wasn't really in control, like my body was moving on its own. I sat down across from him. He looked up at me then, and I swear, I'll never forget the way he looked. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and full of tears. But more than anything, he looked defeated, like someone who had already given up. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for you to see this. I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't know who else to call, you know? I just needed to say goodbye." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I wanted to shake him, to yell at him, to tell him this wasn't the answer, but it was like I was frozen in place. He kept talking, mostly to himself. "The money's gone," he said, his voice cracking. "Didn't last long. Back to being the broke-ass junkie everyone expected me to be. I'm sorry, man. I really am. I can't keep going like this." Then he looked right at me, his eyes piercing into mine. "Goodbye," he said. Before I could say or do anything, that overwhelming euphoria hit me again. It washed over me like a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. My vision blurred, my body felt light, and then nothing. I woke up in my bed. My heart was racing, my pillow damp with sweat. It was just a dream, I told myself. A messed up, vivid dream. I even wrote it down in the journal I'd been keeping for weird dreams. Didn't think much of it after that. That morning, I went about my day like normal. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was Jake's mom. Her voice was shaking as she told me Jake had died the night before. Overdose. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, numb, as she told me the details. How she'd found him in the basement around 1:30 in the morning, how there were bottles and needles everywhere, how he'd relapsed after staying clean for months. She said she thought he'd been doing so well that he'd finally turned a corner. I guess we all did. I hung up, and that's when it hit me. The dream wasn't a dream. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't just in my head. I'd been there. Somehow I'd seen him in that basement, heard his apology, his goodbye, and the time, it matched. It all matched. I still don't believe in ghosts, or the afterlife, or whatever you want to call this. But I believe what I saw that night. I felt it, and I'll never forget it. Story 2. I live in eastern Kentucky, in a quiet hollow where the nights stretch long and the darkness settles deep. Growing up here, you hear stories, things in the woods, whispers about what you shouldn't follow, and places you shouldn't linger after dark. Most of it's just old superstitions, or so I thought. I'd always liked the solitude, though. One evening in late October, a friend invited me to a Halloween party over in Pikeville. I wasn't planning on going, but it had been ages since I'd seen him, so I figured I'd make an appearance. It was one of those laid-back gatherings, the kind where people show up in half costumes, milling around with drinks in hand. The house was decorated, and everyone seemed in good spirits. I just stepped inside when I saw him. He was across the room, leaning against a wall, talking to a few people. For a second, I froze because the recognition hit me like a lightning bolt. I knew him. I couldn't place where, but the feeling was so strong it was almost overwhelming. He must have caught me staring because he turned, his face lighting up with what looked like genuine excitement. "Hey!" he shouted, grinning, waving as enthusiastically as I had just been about to. Without thinking, I waved back. "Oh my God, I haven't seen you in years," I blurted. It was like autopilot. I was already weaving my way through the crowd toward him, my heart pounding. Not out of nerves, but from sheer happiness at seeing an old friend. I mean, it had to have been years, right? Someone I'd lost touch with, college, high school, a mutual friend from the road. It didn't matter at that moment. I was just so thrilled to see him again. When I reached him, he extended his hand, but I went in for a hug instead. It felt natural, familiar. "Man, it's been forever," he said, pulling back. "I know," I replied, laughing. But even as we started talking, the first flicker of doubt hit me. Wait, when was the last time we saw each other? Was it at Charlie's wedding? I asked, fishing blindly. He paused, his brow furrowing. No, I don't think so. Actually, Wait, where do I know you from? That stopped me cold. The certainty I'd had just a minute earlier wavered. Wait, you don't know? He shook his head slowly, laughing nervously. I mean, I thought I knew, but now that I'm really thinking about it. His words trailed off, his expression mirroring mine, confusion mixed with a faint unease. Okay, I said, forcing a smile, trying to shake it off. We'll figure it out. Where'd you grow up? Lexington, he said. That threw me. Lexington? I'm from eastern Kentucky. Did you go to college out here? No, I went to UK. Do you know Mark or Rachel? They're from Lexington too. Nope, he said, shaking his head. It went on like that for several minutes, us playing this weird game of verbal catch, tossing out names, places, events, anything that could connect the two of us. But nothing stuck. The more we talked, the clearer it became. We had never met before, not once. At first I thought it was just me. Maybe I'd gotten too caught up in the moment, mistook him for someone else. But then he said something that made my stomach twist. This is so weird, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. When I saw you across the room, I swore I knew you. Like I was certain. I even remembered your voice somehow, but now I don't know. My throat went dry. Wait, you recognized me too? He nodded. Yeah, and it wasn't just like, oh, you look familiar. It was deeper than that. I was sure I'd met you before. And now it's like it's fading, I finished for him. He stared at me for a moment before nodding slowly. Exactly, it's fading. The more we talked, the more the sensation of familiarity slipped through my fingers like sand. By the time the conversation died, the excitement I'd felt when I first saw him was gone entirely. The warmth, the connection, it was like it had never existed. "I guess we were both mistaken," I said finally, trying to laugh it off, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. "Yeah," he agreed, but his tone didn't match the words. He seemed just as unsettled as I felt. "Weird though, right?" "Really weird," I admitted. I wandered away after that, trying to shake the unease, but the night didn't feel the same anymore. I kept glancing over at him from across the room, half expecting that feeling to come rushing back, but it never did. He stayed on the other side of the party, just another stranger in the crowd. I left early, making some excuse about needing to get up early the next day. As I drove home through the winding back roads, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The strength of that initial recognition had been so intense, so visceral. It didn't feel like a mistake. It wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It felt bigger than that. Like for a brief moment, we had slipped into something else. Another version of reality where we did know each other, where our lives had intersected in ways we couldn't quite remember. And then, just as quickly, we'd been pulled back, left staring at each other across a gap neither of us could bridge. I don't know what that was. Fate, a glitch in the matrix, something else entirely. All I know is, for one fleeting moment, I was completely certain I knew him, and I'd swear on my life he felt the same. Story 3. I grew up in a small village in Greece, tucked away in the hills where the streets were uneven cobblestones, and everyone knew everyone, or at least I thought they did. Our village was the kind of place where time felt slower, where the biggest excitement was the church bell ringing for Sunday service, or an occasional wedding. I didn't believe in much back then. Superstition? Number ghost stories? Definitely not. But there was something about that day, something I can't explain, no matter how many times I go over it in my head. It was late September, and the weather had been strange all week. Hot one moment, cold the next. That day, the skies opened up without warning. I'd just finished helping a neighbor stack some wood for the winter and was on my way home when the storm rolled in. Rain came down in sheets and thunder cracked so loudly it felt like the heavens might split open. I didn't have an umbrella, so I ducked under the nearest tree, a massive, ancient thing that had been standing in the same spot for as long as anyone could remember. I stood there for a few minutes, watching the rain bounce off the cobblestones, the wind howling through the narrow streets. The air smelled like wet earth and something metallic, like the storm itself was alive. That's when I saw her. An old woman hunched over was making her way up the street. She moved slowly, with a deliberate shuffle, holding a black umbrella in one hand and a gnarled walking stick in the other. Her clothes were dark, and her head was wrapped in a faded scarf, the kind you'd see on the older women in the village. But I didn't recognize her, and that struck me as odd. In our village, you knew everyone, every face, every name, every family. But she was a stranger. She stopped when she reached me. Her umbrella tilted slightly, and her face came into view. Her eyes were pale, almost gray, and her skin was wrinkled like crumpled paper. But it wasn't her appearance that unsettled me. It was the way she looked at me, like she was studying me, trying to figure something out. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low but clear, cutting through the rain. "I'm waiting out the storm," I said, trying to sound casual. "I don't want to catch a cold." Her lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You have a long life ahead of you," she said slowly, almost like she was choosing her words carefully. "I would risk catching a cold if I were you." Before I could respond, she turned and started walking down the street, her umbrella bobbing as she moved. I watched her go, confused. Her words hung in the air, heavy and strange. I stood there for a few moments longer, the rain still pounding around me. Then for some reason I decided to take her advice. Maybe it was the look in her eyes or the way her words had sounded more like a warning than a suggestion. Whatever it was, I stepped out from under the tree and started walking home. I hadn't gone more than 100 meters when it happened. A flash of light so bright it blinded me for a second, followed by a deafening crack that made my ears ring. I turned around, heart pounding, and saw the tree I'd been standing under. What was left of it anyway. It had been struck by lightning. The trunk was split clean down the middle, and flames licked at the splintered wood, steam rising as the rain tried to smother the fire. I froze, staring at the smoldering remains. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. If I'd stayed there just a few minutes longer, my chest tightened and I broke into a run. The rain was colder now, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. All I could think about was finding that old woman. I wanted to thank her, to ask her how she'd known, but she was gone. I ran up and down the street, checking every corner, every doorway. I even knocked on a few doors, asking the neighbors if they'd seen her, but no one had. Some gave me strange looks, probably wondering why I was so worked up. Others just shrugged and shook their heads. By the time I got home, I was drenched and shivering. My mother fussed over me, wrapping me in a blanket and making me drink hot tea, but I barely heard her. My mind was stuck on the old woman. Who was she? Where had she come from? And how had she known? I never saw her again. No one in the village ever mentioned her, and when I tried to describe her to the older folks, they just shook their heads and told me I must have been mistaken. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. Story 4. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood with my sister Emily. We lived in a cul-de-sac backed by a dense nature preserve, a tangle of woods, trails, and rumors. There was something about those woods that always felt off. I can't explain it, but they were darker than they should have been, even in broad daylight. Our neighbor Matt was our best friend back then, and we spent countless summer afternoons exploring that preserve, daring each other to go deeper or creep closer to the old mill. The mill was ancient, from the 1700s or something, and half collapsed against a rocky dam. People in the neighborhood always said it was haunted. There were stories about workers drowning there or kids disappearing decades ago. But you know how small-town gossip goes. None of us really believed it, but we still got this weird vibe whenever we went near it. Matt had this beagle mix named Molly, and that dog was practically his shadow. She was always running through our yards, digging holes in flower beds and chasing squirrels. But one afternoon, she was just gone. We were hanging out in Matt's backyard when he realized she wasn't around. At first, we thought maybe she'd wandered back inside or was napping under the deck, but she didn't come when he called. That wasn't like Molly. So Matt, Emily, and I decided to go looking for her. We started at the edge of the woods behind our houses, calling her name. Nothing. After a while, Matt's older brother, Chris, came outside. Chris was 17, tall, confident, and kind of a know-it-all. He looked at us like we were stupid for panicking. "She's probably chasing rabbits," he said, grabbing his jacket. "I'll go one way. You guys go the other. We'll meet back here in an hour." We split up and the three of us headed toward the old mill. Matt didn't say it, but I could tell he was worried. He kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected Molly to come bounding out of the trees. It took us about 20 minutes to reach the mill. The path wound downhill, and the closer we got, the more the air felt heavy. The mill was on the far side of the river, partially hidden by the trees. From where we stood, we could see the old stones of the dam, slick and mossy. That's when we saw Chris. He was on the other side of the river, standing in a small clearing about 30 yards away. His jacket was unzipped, and he was holding Molly by the collar. She was wagging her tail like crazy, jumping around his legs. Matt waved and yelled, "Chris, you found her!" Chris cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back, "Yeah!" She was running around near the clearing. "I'm taking her home." We all just stood there for a second, not moving. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. His voice sounded weird. I glanced at Emily and she had the same look on her face, confused but trying to act normal. Matt didn't say anything either, but I could see it in his eyes. Chris turned and started walking away, disappearing into the woods with Molly trotting behind him. "Wait," Matt called, stepping closer to the edge of the river. "There's no bridge over there. You'll have to come back this way." Chris didn't stop. He didn't even turn around. For a few seconds, none of us said a word. Then Matt looked at us, his face pale. "That didn't feel right," he muttered. Emily nodded. "Yeah, something's off. Should we follow him?" I shook my head. "No, let's just go home. He'll probably beat us there if he's taking the long way around." We turned and started heading back. None of us spoke the whole way. The woods felt quieter than usual. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of our shoes crunching on the dirt path. When we got back to Matt's house, his mom was standing on the porch smiling. "Hey, look who finally came out," she said, pointing under the deck. Molly. She was lying on her side in the shade, chewing on a stick like nothing had happened. Matt froze. "What? How long has she been there?" he asked, his voice shaking. "She never left," his mom said, frowning. "I told you kids that earlier." Matt turned to us, his face pale. "No, that's not possible. We saw her. Chris had her." Emily grabbed my arm. "Where's Chris?" We didn't have to wait long to find out. About 15 minutes later, Chris came strolling down the street, hands in his pockets. He looked annoyed. "Didn't find her," he said as he walked up. "I went all the way to the creek and back. She probably just came out on her own." Matt stared at him. "You were by the mill," he said quietly. Chris frowned. "No, I wasn't. I didn't even go that far." We all just stood there staring at him. "You yelled to us," Matt said. "You said you had her. You were on the other side of the river." Chris's face darkened. "No, I didn't. Are you messing with me right now?" None of us answered. I still don't know who or what we saw that day by the mill. Story 5. I've never been the type of person to believe in fate or signs. Life is chaos, plain and simple. Things happen because they happen, not because some unseen force nudges us around like chess pieces. At least that's what I thought, until one day when something happened that I still can't explain. It was my senior year in high school, one of those sticky, humid afternoons in late spring when the air felt heavy enough to crush you. I was in the locker room after gym class, stuffing my books into my bag, rushing to get to my next class before the bell rang. Our gym locker room was in this old, outdated building that was attached to the school by a breezeway. 4 floors of ancient yellowed brick and glass windows that rattled when the wind blew too hard. The kind of place that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. I was the last one in the locker room, typical. Everyone else had already bolted, leaving the smell of sweat and body spray lingering in the air. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked toward the door, the one that opened out to the breezeway. Then I stopped. I can't tell you why. There was no sound, no movement, no one calling my name, nothing. I just stopped. My hand was halfway to the door handle when my feet refused to move. It wasn't hesitation either. It was like this wall slammed down in my brain, telling me, "Don't move, just wait." For a second I thought, what the hell am I doing? My friends were probably already halfway to class, and here I was, standing like an idiot for no reason. But even as I told myself to go, I couldn't. Something about that moment felt wrong. I glanced around the locker room, like maybe I'd hear or see something that made sense of the feeling. Nothing. Just the usual dim fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the chipped tile floor. My gut was twisting in a way that made my skin crawl, but I had no explanation for it. I took a breath, laughed a little to myself. "Get a grip, man," I muttered. The second I reached for the door handle again, it happened. There was this sharp metallic screech from above me, like nails dragging across steel, followed by a crash so loud it felt like the ground shook. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as shards of glass sprayed out across the pavement just beyond the door. I remember staring through the tiny window in the door, my eyes locked on the pile of shattered glass glittering in the sun. My brain wasn't processing what I was seeing at first. It wasn't until I stepped closer and peered out that I realized what had happened. A massive pane of glass from one of the 4th floor windows had come loose and fallen, smashing onto the ground not even 2 steps in front of where I would have been if I'd opened that door when I first reached for it. I couldn't move. My knees felt like jelly, and my chest was tight like I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. All I could do was stare at the mess in front of me, the jagged edges of the window panes sticking up like teeth in the concrete. If I had walked out when I'd planned to, I didn't need to finish that thought. The scene in front of me said it all. That glass would have come down right on top of me, no doubt about it. I stumbled back, my bag slipping off my shoulder and hitting the floor with a dull thud. My mind was racing, replaying the moment over and over again. Why did I stop? Why couldn't I move? Was it some kind of instinct? A fluke? That's when I noticed something else. There was this eerie silence outside. No birds chirping, no faint hum of traffic from the street. Nothing. It was like the whole world had paused just for that moment. My breath caught as I realized how still everything was. I didn't even hear the usual distant chatter of students in the breezeway. A shiver crawled up my spine. I stepped back from the door and grabbed my bag, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't want to think about what just happened or why. When I finally left the locker room, I didn't look at the glass again. I kept my head down, moving as fast as I could without running. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not the teachers, not my friends. What was I supposed to say? That something stopped me from walking out that door and it saved my life? They'd laugh it off or call me paranoid. But I can't shake the feeling I had in that moment. It wasn't instinct, it wasn't hesitation or coincidence. It was something else, something that knew. Story 6. I used to live in a small town in upstate New York. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. My wife Erin and I rented an old Victorian house on the edge of town. It had charm but was a little too big for just the three of us. Me, Erin, and our 4-year-old daughter Sophie. Still, the price was right, and we figured we'd grow into it. Every night, our routine was the same. Erin would take Sophie upstairs for her bath and tuck her in while I stayed downstairs, finishing work on my laptop. I liked the quiet time, but the house always felt a little off when I was alone. Not in a way I could explain, just little things. A creak when the house wasn't settling, shadows that seemed too sharp in the corner of my eye, but nothing that really made me stop and think. For 3 years it stayed like that, quiet, uneventful, until one cold November night. Erin had gone upstairs with Sophie, like always. I was downstairs typing out emails when the air around me suddenly dropped in temperature. It was so fast and so sharp I thought maybe the furnace had shut off. My hands started shaking, and my breath came out in little puffs like I was standing outside. Then I felt it. Someone was behind me. It wasn't a noise or a shadow or anything physical. I just knew. The way you know someone is standing close to you in a crowd, even if you can't see them. My skin crawled and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't move. I couldn't even turn my head to look. It was like something had locked me in place. Whatever was behind me was staring. I could feel it, boring into the back of my head. My mind raced. What would I even see if I turned around? I didn't want to know. I couldn't stand the thought of it. So I sat there frozen until just as suddenly as it started, the feeling was gone. The room warmed up. I could breathe again. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. Just the same empty living room I'd sat in 100 times before. I didn't tell Erin. What would I say? That I felt something? That I was spooked by the house? She'd laugh it off, and honestly, I wanted to laugh it off too. So I let it go. But the same thing happened the next night, and the next. Each time, the cold, the weight of being watched, the paralysis, it all came back. By the 4th night, I was done pretending it was nothing. I decided I wasn't going to sit at the desk. I'd sit on the sofa instead, where I could see the whole room. I don't know what I thought that would accomplish, but I didn't want my back to the room anymore. That night, Erin and Sophie went upstairs like usual. I stayed on the sofa, pretending to watch TV, but my eyes kept flicking to the edges of the room. It was quiet except for the low hum of the television. Then I saw her. At first, I thought it was Sophie. She stood in the archway between the living room and the hallway, just on the edge of the light. Small, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with long blonde hair and wearing something that looked like pajamas or a nightgown. I opened my mouth to say something, maybe ask why she wasn't in bed, but the words stuck in my throat. Sophie doesn't have blonde hair. I blinked and the girl was still there, staring at me. Her face wasn't clear, like looking through foggy glass. My stomach twisted into knots, but I couldn't look away. She didn't move, just stood there watching. Then, as if nothing was wrong, she turned and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. I don't know what possessed me, but I got up and followed her. I stepped into the hallway expecting to see her, but it was empty. The kitchen light was off. The house was silent. She was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for something, anything to happen. When morning finally came, I told Erin I needed to talk to her. I didn't know how to bring it up, but I had to try. "I've been seeing something," I started, but she interrupted me before I could explain. "Is it the little girl?" My heart nearly stopped. "What?" "The little girl," she said casually, like we were talking about the weather. "I've seen her too. She stands in the hallway sometimes looking at me." You've seen her?" I stammered. Erin nodded, completely unfazed. "Yeah, I told her she could stay as long as she didn't bother us." I couldn't believe how calm she was. "You told her she could stay?" "She doesn't seem dangerous," Erin said with a shrug. "But if it's bothering you, I can say a prayer. Tell her it's okay to leave." I didn't know what to say. Erin was always more religious than me, but the thought of her talking to this thing made my skin crawl. Still, I wasn't about to argue. "Yeah," I muttered. "Maybe you should." That night, Erin lit a candle and said some prayers in the hallway. I stayed upstairs with Sophie, pretending not to notice. After that, we never saw the girl again. We moved out of that house a year later. Story 7. I live in a small, quiet town in eastern Kentucky, not far from where I grew up. It's not much, just a modest house on a quiet street surrounded by woods. I've always liked the peace and quiet. At least I did until that night. I remember it clear as day. It was late, maybe 2 a.m. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. My sister was in the next room, and everything about the night was still, too still. No hum of the fridge, no crickets outside, just this thick, suffocating silence that I didn't notice until later. I was just starting to drift off when I felt it. A wave of heat, sudden and unbearable, washed over me. My skin felt like it was burning, and sweat poured down my face, soaking my shirt. Confused, I tried to sit up, thinking the AC must have gone out. But when I tried to move, I couldn't. My arms, legs, nothing would budge. It was like my body had just locked up. I started to panic. I tried to call out to my sister, but my voice was gone. Nothing came out, not even a whisper. The room felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows pooled darkest, something was there. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But no, there was a figure darker than the shadows themselves, standing perfectly still, watching me. I can't explain the fear I felt. It wasn't normal fear. It was primal, deep in my chest, like my body knew something my brain couldn't comprehend. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat, and I could hear it in my ears. Thump, thump, thump. Like it was the only sound in the world. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, blending into the shadows like it belonged there. Its shape was vaguely human, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. No features, just this void where a face should have been. And then it spoke. "You are not safe." The voice wasn't natural. It sounded distorted, like it came from a broken radio, and it echoed in my head like it wasn't even real. I couldn't process what I was hearing, couldn't even react. I just lay there frozen, staring at this thing that shouldn't exist. And then it moved. It didn't walk, it didn't glide, it just shifted. 1 second it was in the corner, and the next it was at the foot of my bed, close enough that I could feel its presence, like the air around it was heavier, suffocating. It leaned forward slightly, and though it had no face, I swear it was staring straight into my soul. I could feel it, like it was peeling back every layer of who I was, digging into parts of me I didn't even know existed. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe, and I was sure I was going to die right there in my bed. My mind was racing, but my body wouldn't respond. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. Just like that. No sound, no movement. Just gone. As soon as it vanished, I could move again. I shot up in bed, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. My heart was racing, and my clothes were soaked through with sweat. I scrambled to turn on the lamp beside my bed, but my hands were shaking so badly it took a couple of tries. When the light finally came on, the room was empty. My legs locked up. I couldn't move for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of seconds. Then, without thinking, I turned and ran. I sprinted down the trail, calling for Bella at the top of my lungs. "Bella! Bella, come on!" My voice was high-pitched, panicked, and I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The path twisted and turned, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it right behind me. But every time I glanced back, the trail was empty. That didn't make me feel any better. I finally spotted Bella up ahead. She was standing in the middle of the path, staring back at me. "Come on, girl, let's go!" I yelled, and she took off running ahead of me again. I didn't stop until I was out of the woods and back in my yard. My chest was heaving, my legs were shaking, and my hands were trembling so badly I could barely grab my phone to call my neighbor. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just said there was someone in the woods, and I thought they might be dangerous. He came over with a flashlight and his hunting rifle, and we checked the edge of the woods together. Of course, we didn't find anything, but I know what I saw. I haven't walked that trail since. Story 9. When I was around 10, we lived in this old 2-story house in Arizona, not far from where I live now. My parents had bought it for cheap, thinking it'd be a fun project to fix up. The place was falling apart, but to me it was like a big adventure. Every creaky floorboard and dusty corner felt like it had a story. The second floor was where the bedrooms were, though we didn't use all of them. My older brother's room, the one at the end of the hall, was empty back then because we were renovating it. By empty, I mean bare. No furniture, no carpet, just wooden floors and cracked plaster walls. It even had this faint, musty smell, like the wood had been soaked in rain years ago and never fully dried out. For some reason, I liked playing in there. I think it was the echo. When you talked or made noise, it bounced around the room like the walls were talking back. One afternoon, I brought this old puppet with me to play with. You know the kind. Rubber head, floppy cloth body, creepy little eyes that looked too real for something meant for kids. I'd found it in a box in the attic, probably something my brother had when he was younger. The thing looked worn out, like it had been left outside too long, but I loved it. I'd been playing with it for about an hour, doing dumb stuff like making it talk in a silly voice or pretending it was biting my arm. I had this box of Fruit Loops with me. Don't ask why. I was a kid, and I got this idea that the puppet was hungry. So I held up a Fruit Loop and said in the goofiest voice I could manage, "Feed me!" Then I opened the puppet's mouth, popped the cereal inside, and snapped its mouth shut. I sat there grinning like an idiot, waiting for the Fruit Loop to fall out when I opened the mouth again. But when I opened it, there was nothing there. Just the dark little hollow inside the puppet's head. I froze. At first, I thought it had maybe fallen out onto the floor, so I started looking around. The room was empty except for me, the puppet, and that box of cereal. The floors were clean, no cracks or gaps where it could have fallen through. I checked the puppet again, turning it upside down, shaking it. Nothing came out. I remember my heart starting to race, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't explain it. I checked the Fruit Loops box to see if maybe I'd imagined it, like maybe I hadn't fed the puppet at all. But no, the box was open, and there was one less Fruit Loop than before. I sat there staring at the puppet, feeling this weird mix of curiosity and unease, and then it moved. I swear to God, the puppet's head turned. Not fast, not jerky, but slow, like someone turning to look over their shoulder. Its eyes were facing me now, staring right into mine. I didn't scream, didn't drop it. I just sat there, frozen, gripping it so tight my knuckles turned white. It wasn't goofy or playful. It was deep and gravelly, like it came from inside the puppet, but not in a way that made sense. It sounded too far away, like it was coming from the walls, the floor, everywhere all at once. My chest went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to throw it, but I couldn't let go. My hands wouldn't work. I tried to tell myself it was a trick, maybe something my brother had rigged up years ago and forgotten about. But the way it looked at me, those eyes didn't look like they were painted on anymore. They looked alive. That broke me. I don't remember standing up or running out of the room, but the next thing I knew, I was halfway down the stairs clutching the puppet like it was glued to my hands. I was shaking so bad I almost fell. My mom was in the kitchen, and when she saw me, she dropped the dish she was holding. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. "What's wrong?" she asked, rushing over. I couldn't speak. I just shoved the puppet at her, desperate to get it out of my hands. She took it, looking confused, and I backed away, waiting for it to do something. Move, talk, anything. But it just hung there in her hands like it was nothing more than an old toy. I told her what happened. The Fruit Loop, the voice, everything. She frowned, turning the puppet over in her hands, then opened its mouth and looked inside. "There's nothing in here, honey," she said. I didn't care. I refused to go back into that room, refused to touch the puppet ever again. Mom tried to reassure me, said it was probably my imagination, but I could tell she didn't believe her own words. She got rid of the puppet the next day. I don't know if she threw it out or gave it away, but I never saw it again. Story 10. I was a sophomore in college at the time. It was late September, and classes had just started to get serious. I remember the dorm I was in, second floor, a little too far from the bathroom for my liking, and perpetually smelling like instant ramen and burnt popcorn. It wasn't my dorm. I was visiting a girl named Kayla. We'd met in one of our shared gen ed classes, and she had a way of making even the most boring subjects entertaining. That night, we were working on some English assignment together, though, truth be told, I was mostly there to procrastinate. Kayla's room was cramped, like all dorm rooms, with 2 small beds shoved into opposite corners, desks facing the walls, and a mini fridge humming quietly by the window. Her roommate, Jess, was out for the night, something about a study group and maybe a date afterward. I don't know why I remember that detail, but I do. It just felt relevant at the time. Kayla was sitting at her desk, tapping her pen on a notebook while she talked. She had this habit of talking with her hands, even while holding a pen, so every now and then, it would clatter onto the desk. I was sprawled out on her bed, flipping lazily through my notebook, pretending to look busy. The room wasn't messy, but it wasn't exactly tidy either. Jess's desk across from Kayla's was covered in random things: books, a hairbrush, a coffee mug, and one of those neon-colored dry erase markers. I didn't think much of it. We were talking about something dumb. I can't even remember what when it happened. I swear to God, there was no warning, no creak of the bed frame, no movement in the corner of my eye. Just this sudden, sharp thwack. Kayla jerked back, clutching her forehead. "Ow!" she yelled, spinning around to look at me. "What the hell?" I blurted, sitting up so fast I nearly fell off the bed. The dry erase marker, the one that had been sitting on Jess's desk, untouched for the entire evening, was now on the floor, rolling lazily to a stop near Kayla's chair. "Did you just throw that at me?" she demanded, rubbing the spot on her head where it had hit. "What? No, I didn't even move," I said, holding up my hands. She stared at me for a second, her eyes narrowing. "Well, something just hit me in the head." I got up and walked over to where the marker was. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand like it was going to tell me how it had flown across the room on its own. "Kayla, I'm serious. I didn't throw it." She must have seen something in my face because her expression shifted. "Okay, but then, how the hell did it get over here?" I shrugged, suddenly feeling very small in that tiny room. "It was on Jess's desk, wasn't it?" "Yeah," she said slowly, glancing over at the desk. "It was sitting right there next to her notebook." We both stared at Jess's desk like it was going to provide some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. No breeze from the window, no one hiding in the corner, no logical reason for what had just happened. "Maybe it fell," Kayla suggested, though even as she said it, her voice was uncertain. "Fell?" I repeated, holding up the marker. "Kayla, it flew across the room, like it hit you hard enough to leave a mark." She walked over to her mirror and tilted her head, pulling her hair back to check. Sure enough, there was a red spot just above her temple. "That doesn't make any sense," she muttered. "No kidding," I said, setting the marker down on her desk. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air in the room feeling heavier than it had just a few minutes ago. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like the room wasn't empty anymore, like someone else was there with us, just out of sight. Maybe Jess has a ghost, Kayla joked nervously, though her laugh sounded more forced than anything. That's not funny, I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Okay, sorry. She held up her hands. But seriously, what else could it be? Things don't just move like that. I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that my skin was crawling, and I suddenly wanted to be anywhere but in that room. Maybe it was like static electricity or something, Kayla said after a moment, though she didn't sound convinced. Static electricity? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. What, like the marker just decided to yeet itself across the room because of some static? Come on, Kayla. Well, do you have a better explanation? She shot back. No, I admitted, glancing around the room like I expected to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But I don't think static electricity can throw things at people. We both fell silent again, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. I kept looking at that marker, half expecting it to move again. But it didn't. It just sat there on the desk, as if nothing had happened. I don't like this, I said finally. Kayla nodded, her face pale. Yeah, me neither. We didn't talk much after that. I left not long after, mumbling something about having an early class the next day. Kayla didn't try to stop me. I never went back to her dorm room after that. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.